Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our alumni panel, Careers in Social Justice, Law Reform and Advocacy, presented by ANU Law Reform and Social Justice. My name is Cherish Tay, and I'm a Bachelor of Asian Studies and Bachelor of Law student here at ANU. And I'm very excited and very much looking forward to tonight's conversation. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we gather. That's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance. Justice and recognition for Indigenous peoples is central to any discussion of social justice in Australia. And I look forward to our panellists shedding light on the role of future legal graduates in this space. Law reform and social justice lie at the heart of the ethos of the ANU College of Law, and we're privileged to be joined by our panel whose careers embody that commitment. Tonight we have Suzie, who is an Associate Manager at TrialWatch at the Clooney Foundation for Justice, Lauren, a Criminal Solicitor at the Aboriginal Legal Service, Mark, a Research and Policy Consultant at the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, Sophie, as our last panellist, is an Executive Officer at Change the Record. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd just like to hand over to Associate Professor Matthew Zagor, Director of ANU Law Reform and Social Justice, to offer his opening remarks.
So I'd like to join you in acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to their elders, families, forebearers. Sovereignty over the land and waters of Australia was never ceded. Treaties are yet to be negotiated, and the work of reconciliation remains of vital importance. As Cherish said, social justice lies at the heart of the ethos of the ANU College of Law, and we must start with this imperative. So this event is just one of many limbs of a strategy I have as the LRSJ director to mainstream, so to speak, careers in social justice and law reform, to bring to the forefront the various opportunities and pathways that exist into the sector by promoting things like internships, job opportunities, graduate programs, even postgraduate courses at other institutions. And of course, there are the many LRSJ projects on a host of social and environmental justice issues, which provide students with a chance to hone their skills as practitioners and campaigners even before they've got the legal qualifications under their belt. I want students to leave law school with as much, if not more, familiarity with the community sector and with law reform advocacy as they do with the big firms. Students have long complained that they only hear about the public sector and the private firms, which have an overwhelming presence on campus. And I think it's long past time for us to redress that imbalance and put justice careers squarely on the map for the law reform for the ANU Law students. So we have several initiatives in this space. The LRSJ has a social justice careers project, for instance, which has revised and redrafted the Justice Careers Guide that we hope to launch in the next month or so. It will appear on our new website. We're also seeing LRSJ projects teaming up with community-based organizations, local, national, regional, even international, assisting in the preparation of reports, doing basic research, meeting with clients, making law reform submissions, appearing before Parliament to support those submissions, and working on human rights and environmental campaigns. And we're seeing better integration between the objectives of the LRSJ in this space and the law curriculum more generally. So not least in the internship program, which I'm also the convener of. In the current cohort, for instance, we have students working on or with Gun Control Australia, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, several with the Darwin Community Legal Service, the Consumer Law Centre, Canberra Community Law, Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, IACSIS, to name just a few. We've also got a couple of students working with me in the law reform and social justice space, working on environmental justice and accountability for ministers and Parliament, very topical issue, and working with Associate Professor Kate Ogg on diversifying the curriculum so that we can better incorporate gender perspectives, Indigenous perspectives, decolonial perspectives in the curriculum. The other thing, of course, that we're doing is we're inviting ANU alumni to share their stories with us, how they got to where they are, the obstacles and opportunities, the roadblocks, the lucky breaks that they had on the way. Current students need to be exposed to these stories. They need to be able to imagine themselves, to envisage themselves taking similar paths. And we have a fabulous panel of former students who are doing varied and innovative things in the sector. I'm going to flick back to Cherish to tell us more about them and to run this evening's event. Cherish, of course, is also a student ambassador. She didn't introduce herself properly. She's a student ambassador for the college, and she's an active member of the Law Reform and Social Justice Programme. It's great to see you all here.
Thanks for that, Matt. Yes, so now I'd like to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Maybe we'll start with Suzie. Would you be able to tell us a bit about yourself and your roles at the moment?
Sure. So I graduated from the ANU in 2012, which doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it is a while ago now. So I, as you said, Cherish, I work at the Clooney Foundation for Justice as the Associate Program Manager of the TrialWatch initiative. And that initiative looks to monitor the criminal trials of vulnerable groups. So predominantly we focus on women and girls, journalists, members of the LGBTIQ plus community, as well as other minorities and also human rights defenders. And so we work with local monitors who can go into the courtroom and monitor what's happening in the trials. We use that to kind of document any fair trial rights violations, and from that we draft a report which we then use for further advocacy, whether it's domestically in the jurisdiction where those defendants are from, or whether it's more internationally or regionally. I'm also working as a co-founder of the Reb Law Movement Lawyering Conference, which happened recently. So there's 5 kind of co-organisers. So we are really kind of focused on introducing the concept of movement lawyering in the Australian community. And we had a great turnout. And I think Sophie was also there because I remember her actively engaging. So yes, so I guess those are kind of the varied roles that I engage in at the moment.
Thank you. Wow, that sounds fascinating. I can't wait to get more into that throughout the discussion tonight. But could I ask Lauren, would you be able to tell us a bit about your work and yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So thank you for having me tonight. I only graduated from the ANU at the end of 2019. So I guess my perspective is probably the new career. I'm still at the very beginning. I've only been a solicitor. I was admitted less than a year ago, so I'm very new to this space, but I was really lucky to be able to move immediately into the community law space. So I'm currently a solicitor here in Canberra at the Aboriginal Legal Service. I work as a criminal solicitor. I'm specifically employed as a duty solicitor, which means the bulk of my work is dependent on how many Indigenous people are arrested every 24-hour cycle, going and speaking to them in cells, doing a lot of bail applications, sentences, mentions, hearings as well. So my pathway here was I started out as a Supreme Court associate in Canberra and also was an associate at the Magistrates Court, which is sort of how I stepped fairly quickly into practice. And I've been at the Aboriginal Legal Service now just over 6 months. Yeah.
Wow. It sounds like even though you've only recently been admitted, you've managed to fit a lot in.
Unfortunately, life at a community legal centre means that your experience in 6 months is probably equivalent to a few years in a private firm or in a different sector. I sometimes appear for up to 30 clients a week in court. think that was
Wow.
one of my more record weeks, was close to 30. So there's a lot of advocacy experience, and there is just not the resources for me to be, having a nice little cushy training period. I was in a contested bail application by 11 a.m. on my very first day. I actually hadn't even received my practicing certificate, so I had to seek leave to appear because it hadn't been processed yet. So yeah, it's been a very, very steep and very quick learning curve for sure.
Wow, yeah, it sounds like you rose to the challenge though, and that's very impressive.
Trying at least.
Next, Mark, would you be able to tell us a bit about your work and what you do at the UN?
Thanks, everyone. So my name's Mark, and I currently work at UNHCR office here in Canberra, which also has coverage of New Zealand and 14 Pacific Island countries and territories. I've worked here for about 12 months. I'm one of the people who have come back to Canberra with Corona sort of conundrums as the years have been. So on a day-to-day basis, I do refugee status determinations. I do a bit of training of Pacific Islands decision makers, and I also have a sort of law reform part of my job. So at the moment we're doing some work with Kiribati on statelessness in their citizenship laws. So that's been keeping me very busy. But yeah, so that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. And in the last sort of 2-3 months, obviously a lot of Afghanistan related work and phone calls, and just keeping things moving on that sort of front very depressingly. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we have such a range of careers represented on the panel tonight. It's great to see. Sophie, you're last but not least. Could you give us a little introduction to you and your work?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophie. I'm the Executive Officer of Change the Record, which is a First Nations-led coalition of a bunch of different Aboriginal-controlled community organisations and non-Indigenous allies. And we have two main goals. One is to end the mass incarceration of First Nations people, and the other is to end the disproportionate rate of family violence that's experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. I began my career in politics and then moved into an ALS in Alice Springs and practiced as a youth lawyer there for a number of years before working on the Raise the Age campaign and joining Change the Record. And hearing Lauren talk about the work that she's done as a duty lawyer brought back extremely unpleasant memories. I found the first 6 months of practicing as a lawyer probably the most difficult months of my career, politics and law and now advocacy all included. So that's really phenomenal, Lauren, that you seem to have thrived so much in what's a very difficult environment. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to chatting about how we all got to where we are and the sort of pathways that are available for students who want to pursue social justice and the law.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the panel definitely shows that career pathways across social justice, law reform, advocacy are, as diverse as the professionals who work in those fields. I'd like to ask the panel, what inspired you to pursue this career path? Did your motivation take root before law school, or was it fostered by a particular person or experience, or did it come after graduation during an early career experience? Perhaps Suzie, can I ask you to start us off?
Sure. So I would say that my inspiration to pursue the social justice kind of path probably started when I was quite young. So I was actually born in Poland just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, and my parents are mixed race. Well, my dad is Zambian, my mum's Polish, so they had a mixed race marriage, which obviously caused a bit of a stir in Poland, which is predominantly white. And even as we're seeing today, you know, people do often discriminate against minority groups. So my parents, and particularly my father, experienced a lot of discrimination. And I think it was probably this firsthand experience that really kind of sparked, I guess, in me the fire to address some of these issues around discrimination and inequality. And I guess that was one of the reasons also that I chose to go to the ANU. I thought that it provided a lot of opportunities to engage with really interesting subjects, as well as the opportunity to kind of go overseas and do courses with at the UN. So that was kind of, yeah, my thinking and motivation into attending the ANU. And then unfortunately, as Matthew said, I guess the big push was really to kind of focus on corporate law and the public sector. So while I did try and look for jobs in social justice straight out of law school, I ended up working in a corporate law firm at Gilbert and Tobin, which wasn't terrible because they had a great pro bono program and I was really actively engaged in the pro bono program. So after spending a few years there, I then moved in-house and somehow managed to convince the General Counsel of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise to let me also run the pro bono program there while working as while working as a lawyer there. So it was kind of those experiences that eventually led me to realize that the only joy I was getting out of corporate law was actually doing the pro bono work. And I thought probably time to make it a full-time career. And I kind of thought I've had enough experience in the corporate sector and have probably gained the skills that I need to gain, which are obviously very transferable. So that's when I decided to pursue the career in human rights and kind of used an LLM to transition from corporate law into human rights.
Yeah, wow. You took a sort of a route to get to pro bono, but yeah, amazing to hear about the like really personal underpinning that drives you. Yeah, Mark, did you want to wade in on what motivated you to take this career pathway?
Yeah, sure. So I actually did, I graduated in 2017 and I did a bit of volunteering through the Law Reform and Social Justice program, and it's great to see it move from strength to strength. It was just really kicking off when I was in the final years of my degree. So I did worked on a few submissions for Parliament and did some of the community legal education stuff in high schools, which at that time seemed a bit weird and like different, but it's actually an amazingly useful skill. And I'm currently organising a community consultation in Kiribati. So who would have thought community legal education would be so useful and relevant to what I'm doing right now. So in terms of ending up in Samoa, I got a random email out of the blue from the Law Reform and Social Justice part of the uni about an opportunity to be an intern in the Law Reform Commission. So I spent half a summer doing a clerkship in Melbourne, and then the other half of the summer at the Samoan Law Reform Commission, wearing a very, very bright sort of bula type shirt, the two exact opposites of the legal profession. And from there, I ended up getting quite involved in the work of a group, a sort of an LGBTI rights group there. I ended up doing an honours thesis on LGBT law reform with the wonderful Wayne Morgan of the ANU, and ended up returning to Samoa to do work within the UN system. And yeah, the rest is history. The once you're in the system, you know, you never leave. It's
Wow, that's an just a small personal aside. I last semester did a LGBTI research project on LGBTI law reform in Taiwan with Wayne Morgan. So I see that there's generations of us. But yeah, sounds like an amazing journey. Lauren, would you be able to tell us a little bit about your inspirations?
Yeah, of course. So I spent most of high school doing, specialist maths, physics, chemistry, and was convinced I was going to be an engineer, was ready to do engineering and science at the University of Adelaide, so I went to high school. And halfway through year 12, I just went, actually, I'm going to move to Canberra and study law and international relations because that sounds like a good thing to do. I was one of those students that went, I'm never going to be a lawyer. Lawyers just sit in offices and write contracts and it's really boring and rip people off. That's what a lawyer is. And it actually took me a concerning number of years of my law degree to realise what other options there were for me. I'm really, I think, keen to get involved in events like this and other things because I feel like so many students come to law school wanting to make a difference and caring about human rights and caring about justice, and just it becomes almost a bit of a meme to say you're a law student who wants to make a difference. Like, it's not a very, you kind of got to laugh off, I just came here because I want to change the world. And it really gets, and there's no real clear pathway for the people who do want to do that. And then I think just clerkships get so thrown down your throat. You're like, I better apply for that because that's what all the other high achievers around me are doing. So that's what I need to do. So really, I think I came to law school, wanting to do that, but I had no idea what it would look like. And I really thought it would come from my arts and international relations degree, not from my law degree. The law degree was to help my employability. And I think in terms of wanting to go into social justice, though, it just really came from just a deep sense of injustice about some of the things I saw in the world around me growing up, and just going, well, we can't just look at these things and not do anything about it, sort of thing. My family, my parents looked after foster children for a while, and I lived with Indigenous foster children, and I think that was also a really informative experience in terms of being interested in the Indigenous justice space. In fourth year, at the end of fourth year, I didn't get a clerkship, and instead I went and did an Aurora internship in the Northern Territory. And I worked at the Aboriginal Justice Unit there, where I was looking at drafting an Aboriginal Justice Agreement. And as in all Indigenous justice spaces, they were hugely under-resourced. And even though I was a student intern, I got huge responsibilities for drafting and writing. And I did a lot of work with the statistics, and it was really horrifying, as would be expected. And I think I went there expecting it, but I really loved the work. And I think that started to show me some of the spaces I could actually work in. And I came back and I did the ANU clinical program, volunteering 1 day a week at ALS, and went, firstly, these guys are doing really cool work. Like, the clients are just face, discrimination and disadvantage and barriers at every single stage of the criminal justice system. And secondly, I thought, these guys get to go to court every day. That's awesome. I don't want to sit in an office. I want to go to court every day. And I'm really lucky since then. I got the opportunity to go back to the NT for another internship with the Aboriginal Legal Service up there. And then through the connections through the ANU clinical program, I actually got an associateship at the Magistrates Court, Supreme Court. And I was extremely lucky that when I was wrapping up my associateship, there was a job opening at the ALS here. It doesn't happen very often. I think there's been maybe 2 jobs advertised here in the past 3 or 4 years. So there was a lot of luck in the timing being right. And I'd previously interned here, and I was just lucky I had enough court exposure that they felt confident that they could say, you're going to be in court from day one. And we hope you're okay with that. But yeah, I think in terms of the social justice careers, it's really important that, law students feel that they can say that they care and they want to make the world a better place. And a law degree is so empowering to do that. I think I felt such a difference in terms of empowerment, like since being admitted as a solicitor and being able to, you know, walk into court and just say to someone, hi, I'm Lauren, I'm your lawyer, I'm going to help you out today. And for all the difficulties they're facing, you can at least, you know, make that one part of their life or that one stressful challenge they're facing, like hopefully a little bit better, or at least make sure they're being listened to. And I've certainly found that for all the difficulties with working in the community sector or the social justice sector, whether it's, you know, low pay, being under-resourced, difficult to get jobs, requiring lots of qualifications, sometimes just to get an entry-level sort of position, it is just the most fulfilling and rewarding job I could think of. And there's something amazing about doing a job where you really feel like you're helping people. And I really think that should be talked about more often in terms of law careers and pathways.
Yeah, sounds like you took a winding route, but yeah, I definitely.
It did take me until 5th year to realise that I could be a lawyer and go to court, and I could be a lawyer and do something good for society, which is concerning, I think. But I got here in the end, and I, you know, wouldn't have it any other way now for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a lot of promotion of clerkships, and I kind of wish there was, you know, more alternatives that seem just as, you know, just as competitive and just as viable as careers, long-term careers.
Yeah, I think it's certainly difficult as a law student to, you know, ignore that one, but also it's just a considered thing that if you're getting good grades and you're doing extracurricular, then you should get a clerkship, because, you know, that's what the good law students are doing, rather than being asked to really think about, well, what do you want with your law degree and your law career.
Yeah. Sophie, do you want to wade in, tell us a little bit about your motivations?
Sure. Well, I had no intention of ever being a lawyer. I just studied law because everyone else in my family was a doctor. And as a very sort of middle class, white, high achieving student, the choices were be a lawyer or be a doctor. So I thought I would study law and then, you know, use that time studying law to work out what I really wanted to do. So I ended up studying while I was working in politics. I worked in federal parliament for the Greens, doing originally as a media advisor and then eventually as a chief of staff, I guess trying to work in the social justice space in a political sphere, and seeing that as a route to try and create some of the systemic, like, law reform change from a political level. I really loved the work. It was extremely challenging. In many ways, it was a really good foundation to be a lawyer. Like, these are extremely long days, extremely high pressure environments, lots of public facing work, lots of learning while in a public realm, which I think is one of the most challenging things about being a courtroom lawyer, is having to learn in public. I think there are lots of synergies there with working in politics. And then it got to a point where whenever there's an election in federal politics, all the officers, all the staff members are spilled. So you're automatically made redundant, and then you decide whether or not to reapply for your job. And so that happened after a routine election, and I decided that it was time for a change and that maybe I would try and be a lawyer. After all, having felt very disconnected from the people who I was sort of purportedly trying to work for in politics, but never having done any of that groundwork, never having been involved in the communities that, you know, we were supposedly serving. So I, much like Lauren, realised that there is a world in which one can be a sort of social justice lawyer, but it's competitive and it's difficult to get into, and there weren't any vacancies at what was called CALIS, which was the Aboriginal Legal Service in Alice Springs. It's now NAJA. There weren't any vacancies at CALIS at the time, but I decided that I would just move to Alice Springs anyway and hope that I could volunteer there until they gave me a job. So I did that. I got my L's and learnt to drive and then drove to Alice Springs and started volunteering for Carlos. And it was right at the time when the Royal Commission into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, but in effect Aboriginal children in protection or in detention in the Northern Territory was underway. And so I started in a volunteer role, basically compiling all of the evidence and testimonies from these young people that Carlos then put forward in the Royal Commission to demonstrate some of the mistreatment and abuse that occurred. And that was a pathway to an eventual job as a solicitor there, and I managed the youth practice in Alice Springs, working with some of those children who were then older children, as well as others. And it was incredible work in terms of the relationships with families in particular. Alice is a small place. You live in community with people. You become very close to your clients and their families. In Alice, particularly the grandmothers, who are an extremely vocal, political, organised group of women. I also found it extremely distressing. And towards the end of my time in Alice, I felt that I wanted to try and pursue advocacy back again at a systemic level. Because while the work as a lawyer on the ground is essential, it's also very difficult if the laws are fundamentally so cruel and so oppressive. So I decided to pursue that, and Change the Record was an obvious place to look as an organisation that is sort of fundamentally dedicated to that work. There were big concerns for me, and like a lot of negotiation that went on around the fact that I'm a non-Aboriginal person, and Change the Record is an Aboriginal organisation. And I'm sure we can talk about that later around.
Yes, I will be asking you a little bit later about that one. Yeah.
Totally, but that's basically how I ended up in this role.
I think that's amazing how you to some extent went on your own steam up to Alice Springs without necessarily having a job offer yet, and sort of thinking that's what you really want to do, so you'll go up anyway. I think that it's amazing.
Not everyone agreed at the time, but it worked out.
Yeah, I'm sure. So perhaps the next question I will give to Suzie and Mark. So you both undertook LLM degrees, and that was after you graduated from ANU, and you undertook those postgraduate studies overseas, and you also now work in roles with distinct international outlooks. Suzie, you specialised in human rights, while Matt, you focused on development studies. Just want to ask, did you see postgraduate study as a necessary step to establishing yourself in your current roles? I mean, it doesn't have to have been a necessary step, and if it wasn't, what were for people who might be looking to follow in your footsteps?
Mark, do you want to go first?
Sure.
I thought I'd change the system around a bit since.
Amazing. Break the rules. Break the rules.
Exactly.
So firstly, in defence of clerkships, do a clerkship. It'll help you get a better social justice job. For some reason, people assume that if you've done a clerkship, then you might be better. But talking from having to do postgraduate study, if you want to do UN stuff, sadly, you will at some point have to do a master's, which for Australians, I think it doesn't really make that much sense, because you do sort of 5 years of uni, and the person who would be getting your job has 2 masters, but has only done 6 years all up. So the whole system, the UN system, sort of designed for Europeans, weirdly. and in terms of my first 2 jobs in the UN, you explicitly needed to speak French and have a master's. So, and I speak French, so I had to do one eventually. Yeah, so unfortunately, that's one of the things about particularly international facing roles. There's that credentialism, which is just a part of the beast, and something that you should keep in mind. Be nice to your academics, because you might have to get them to write you nice references to get you in somewhere. So
Good advice.
So as I said, I have a Polish mother, so very European. So it was, so yes, so I think it was kind of an unspoken rule in my household that we would all do masters. So I always kind of went into law school knowing that eventually I would do a master's. I think she would be overjoyed if I decided to do a PhD at some point. At this point, I have no such plans. Yeah, so I did the LLM at Columbia University. Probably, I chose Columbia University again strategically, I guess, because they had a lot of clinical courses, and after having practiced law for a number of years, I didn't want to kind of lose that element. I wanted to do a practical course where I could do theoretical study as well as using the skills that I had gained as a lawyer to be able to actually do some practical work while I was studying. So I knew that Columbia had a great human rights clinic, and so that is kind of why I chose it. And I also used it to kind of transition, as I said, from corporate law to human rights law. I think it's very possible to go straight from a corporate law career into human rights, and I know there's a lot of precedent and examples in the Australian context of lawyers who started in corporate law and then have moved into social justice jobs. But I guess for me, I just didn't feel like I had maybe enough experience, and I wanted to kind of, I guess, upskill a little bit as well. And yeah, so I also hadn't had the experience, I guess, so much with working with international organizations. So that was something that doing the Human Rights Clinic at Columbia offered. So we got to partner with a local organization. So I worked on a project that was based in the Central African Republic, and got to travel over there twice, which was really interesting and also terrifying. But it was amazing to meet with the clinic partners and actually work with them and understand why they had decided to focus on these projects, and really, rather than, I guess, using our role as lawyers at, an Ivy League university to kind of claim, I guess, some of the credit for the work that was going on, really kind of empowering them to do that work. So we helped them with submitting shadow reports to the UN, and also helped to get funding to send some of those partners to Geneva so that they could lobby and talk to some of the UN countries to get them to talk about what was actually happening in the Central African Republic, predominantly for Muslim citizens. So that was really, really interesting. And I think that kind of inspired, I guess, the movement lawyering aspect, which I've tried to kind of incorporate into my work since then. I don't think, as I said, I don't think it's necessary to do a LLM overseas. Maybe if you're planning on working at the UN, it sounds like, but you also obviously have to know one of the UN languages. But I think if you're planning on doing work just generally in social justice, probably not necessary. I know even with some of the international human rights work, a lot of the American students just do a JD and kind of then go into human rights careers without needing to do an LLM. So it really isn't strictly necessary, although I do suggest it if you feel like you want to upskill.
Right, I see. Yeah, but it seems like it really broadened both of you and professionally and also in terms of experience. Yeah, I hadn't thought about LLMs in that sort of way before. I think, yeah, particularly in Australia, as you said, Mark, it sort of isn't necessarily something that you need to do. You just stick with your LLB. You'll be fine. You can be practicing.
So I actually did a development economics postgraduate. I didn't do an LLM.
But yeah.
But it's, I mean, I think a lot of the similar things apply, and it's something that you shouldn't take lightly, and it, you know, can cost a lot of money and you know, there's a year of your life or 2 years, whatever.
And I would say that it's very, very intense, particularly if you've come out of practicing for a few years and going back to university. I completely forgot how exhausting just learning was. So yes, it was probably the most intense 9 months of my life, I would say.
Now a question for Sophie and Lauren. I think we touched on this earlier, Sophie, but you both share common ground in your commitment to improving access to justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and your advocacy through movements including the Raise the Age movement and Black Lives Matter. But what do you find most meaningful about your work, and what does it mean to be a First Nations ally in a professional sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, particularly the question around allyship. Like, that's a big question for me. It's definitely like an always evolving question. And I think it is, you know, there are principles that are the same, but it's also different depending on whether you're practicing as a courtroom lawyer or whether you're in a role like mine, where you have sort of different professional obligations and different ways that you can challenge the system. So, I mean, you asked first, like, what is the best part? I mean, I miss deeply working with clients. I loved working with kids and working with their families. It was, I mean, I broke probably most of the rules around, you know, not getting emotionally involved with your clients and having professional separation and all of that stuff. It really didn't work like that for me at all, particularly not out bush. These are small communities. You're often with, when I was doing civil work with young people, those were matters that would last years. You know, you became very close to your clients and you cared about them a lot. And you know, personal and professional life just overlaps in a small place. Like, you give people lifts and you eat together, and you know, you also do political advocacy with grandmas when that's something that they want to do, and you know, the lines all get pretty blurry. So I missed that a lot, and that was for me by far the most rewarding part of the work. And I think also an essential part of being an ally is forming relationships, not necessarily of that nature, but relationships that are grounded in mutual respect and in trust. And that sort of by its nature will vary depending on what your role is and what the community and those individuals want your role to be. And I think for me, that was something that I really struggled with being a lawyer, in terms of what I wanted to offer, and what community members wanted from me, and what the law and my professional role as a lawyer allowed me to do, or what I perceived it allowed me to do. And you know, there were lots of, I found real ethical challenges in working out how to navigate that, how to push back within my organisation, how to push back within a courtroom, and really within the legal fraternity. There's a very conservative culture amongst lawyers, including amongst sort of social justice lawyers. And I think you have to be really prepared for the fact that while there'll be amazing professional camaraderie and you can work together, and conferences like the one that Suzie put on are really great examples of lots of professionals getting together in the same room to try to work out how to use law as a tool for changing things and disrupting systems. you will also face, you know, lots of obstacles from other lawyers who don't want you to speak out about certain things. An example comes to mind of a judge that you may have read about, Judge Borchers in Alice Springs, who frequently made overtly racist comments about children, Aboriginal children in the courtroom. And I spoke out publicly about that, and it was really not welcomed by the rest of the legal profession, including other ALS lawyers. So I think, you know, it's being an ally is also about thinking, what's the role that I occupy? And even though this might be something that is harmful to me and my professional standing, you know, it may be a necessary or productive thing to do. I think now in my role has changed the record very quickly. Part of the reason why I'm sort of comfortable in this role is because when I took the job, we negotiated with our Black Caucus, which is our Aboriginal leadership committee, that part of my job would be finding an Aboriginal person to replace me and setting the organisation up in such a way that we, you know, have Black leadership at the heart of what we do. And my role is to sort of do some of that, yes, some of the public facing work and advocacy, but also that organisational work, like find the money, find the resources that we need so that, you know, Aboriginal people can take on leadership positions within our organisation so that it can be truly led by and for First Nations people. And I'm extremely excited that we are well on the way to that being a reality. But for me, those are some practical ways of being an ally. But, you know, I also get called out by my Black Caucus when I, you know, misstep and I forget and I get caught up in my own ways of doing things. And I think it's an active process of learning.
Thanks, Soph. Just before Lauren, you go, I just want to remind everyone who's watching to put any questions they have into the Q&A function, and we'll happily take them. Yeah, so you go ahead, Lauren.
Thanks. So I mean, I wholeheartedly second everything Sophie said to begin with. In terms of the best part of the job, my clients are absolutely the best part of my day. And even though Canberra is a really different situation to Alice, there's still a really small and strong community here, and getting to know clients' families and their stories. You're put in such a position of trust as their solicitor that people do really have to open up to you and share your story, sometimes within a few minutes of share their story, sometimes within a few minutes of meeting you. And that's a really, I think, special part of the job, being like welcomed into the community in some respects. One awesome part of my job as the junior solicitor here is I get to do the Gallimbani Circle Sentencing Court, which is where a panel of elders sit in on sentencing, and I do that once a fortnight. And the fact that I've been able to do that on an ongoing basis, I've been able to develop relationships with the elders, and as part of that process, the participants, so the client, comes along and shares their story and explains, I guess, really what's happened to make them end up in the system. And it's such a powerful part of the system, and they're the most emotionally draining days I have, but absolutely my favourite part of the job. In terms of allyship, I think the biggest thing to always keep in mind as an ally is like whose voices you're centering, and always just constantly reflecting on what space you're taking up, and could that space be taken up by an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person. I think there's unfortunately a tendency in Australia, in our discussions of Indigenous issues, for non-Indigenous Australians to go, well, that's an Indigenous issue and I don't want to almost call it out. It's this you know, idea that we don't want to discuss racism and we don't want to even talk about race because we're concerned about coming across as racist in doing that. And I think in that way, some non-Indigenous Australians just separate themselves from the conversation, like that's an Indigenous problem, so it's better I stay out of it. And I think that's such a problematic part of our culture, and as Australians coming to grips with our history and the need for going forward to treaty making and listening and truth telling for our country to really be able to get past what a horrific history we have. And so I think it's firstly really important to recognise that Indigenous issues are issues for all Australians, and we all need to, I think, take on some kind of responsibility in helping that. But at the same time, when you're working in this space, I'd say the biggest part of my job, or the most important part of my job, is listening. I'm there to help my clients and to support my clients, but at the end of the day, they're in charge. It's their life, it's their legal matter. If they want to completely go against my legal advice, it's my responsibility as a lawyer to fulfill their wishes. And so I think that is really important as a lawyer, obviously, but just more broadly as an ally in this space, we need to be listening to Indigenous voices and being guided in our actions, our behaviour, our words by that. And part of that is reflecting regularly, as Sophie's talked about, is, is my behaviour in line with what the community wants? And am I reflecting that in the actions? Am I taking up a spot that would be better taken up by an Indigenous person? And so it involves regular reflection and thinking about, but I'm it took me a long time, I think, to feel comfortable even speaking on these issues, because I was so conscious of being a white person speaking in this area. And I thought, on one hand, I feel a real sense of duty and obligation to contribute in this area because it's such a source of injustice, and the treatment of Indigenous Australians, particularly in the criminal justice system, should be a source of shame for everyone in the country. So I felt this real sense of duty, but I felt uncomfortable talking about it. For me, working with a number of my mentors are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so I feel that I use them as a sounding board to some extent and have been able to have these conversations about that space. I did my honours thesis in law with Anthony Hopkins at ANU, and I was looking at domestic violence legislation in remote communities, and a really big part of me preparing for the thesis and doing my research was having a lot of conversations with Anthony about positionality and how I sat and how I felt about working in this space, because I felt some discomfort to begin with, and he really encouraged me to, still want to be, speak out and do my research in the space. But, a big focus of the thesis was making sure that I was looking at Indigenous scholars and, reading work by Indigenous authors or reports, looking specifically at what, community consultations had said and things like that. So it's a difficult situation, and as an ally, you're definitely not always going to do the right thing. But as long as you keep an open mind and just are always thinking about whose voices you're centering and who are you platforming, I think that's really important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lauren and Sophie, for those really thoughtful reflections on that difficult subject. I'm very mindful of the time, but I just want to throw one very large question at all of you while I have the chance. That is, I'd like to ask each of you what you see as the most pressing challenges facing us, not just as citizens of the world and Australia, but as the next generation of lawyers and advocates and researchers and policymakers. What do you think students now should be thinking about and working towards? Perhaps can I ask Suzie to start us off on that question? Perhaps if people could keep their responses to about 1 minute as well, just due to time.
Sure. That is a very, very big question, and I've been thinking about this question since you sent it. But I think the biggest challenge that we are probably facing as humanity is probably climate change, and I think that affects the work that we're going to do. It affects the work that I'm doing and the work that I'm sure that all of the other panelists are going to be doing, because you can't be addressing issues of social justice if we don't have a healthy, safe planet to live on. So I think for students who are thinking of going into social justice or going into policy or research or any other careers, it's definitely one to think about how it's going to impact what you are planning on doing, because it definitely will.
Also, I might ask Mark to go next, but also, Mark, could you shed light on this question we've got in the Q&A box of whether students should be, who are still considering whether to do their practical legal training, what advice you would give to them and what opportunities there are for law reform research careers?
Thanks. So one thing is you can actually do your practical legal training. I'm saying this as someone who doesn't have a GDLP, by the way. You can actually do your PLT at some law reform commissions in the Pacific, in common law jurisdictions. And I know a bunch of people who have, and it's apparently really, really interesting. You can also do it in some international organizations, as long as you manage to sort of strong arm some sort of poor colleague who happens to be a lawyer to supervise you. So that's the thing you can do. In terms of the pressing social issues, I mean, in the lead up to Glasgow, climate change would be a popular choice, I think, for this answer. However, for me, I'm going to be very narrow and perhaps urban. For me, the big issue that I think is going to come, let's say just in Australia in the next years, is housing and inequality. I think this is a ticking time bomb, and it could be the start of an even more two-tiered society. The haves, who due to age, luck, or, you know, a great aunt in Sydney owned land or property, and the have-nots, who are sort of a rentier class. So we're seeing in urban bits of Australia sort of a return to or a greater division of wealth that doesn't actually seem to be going anywhere and is becoming less and less, is becoming an ongoing problem, and is also going to see a whole bunch of people who have done everything right in their view and aren't able to, you know, live the places where they are from. So I think if we don't solve this policy issue one way or another, then I don't think Australia is immune from the social unrest and even violence that you see in other countries where growing inequality and a lack of political solutions aren't achieved. So that's my rant. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, maybe Lauren, we'll head over to you. If you and Sophie could keep your answers very brief. I'm sorry, we're running out of time.
I mean, I wholeheartedly, you know, concur with the climate change and housing. I just such a concerning number of clients that are homeless, and that's in Canberra, and it's just so distressing. But I think the thing that probably concerns me most of all is this growing sort of, and as an Australian, like this apathy towards like politics and disengagement from politics. It's such a big issue that we can hardly get into, but I think so many individuals kind of go, I can't change it, there's nothing I can do about it, so I'll just ignore it. But we are, you know, a wealthy, well-educated country. We should be asking for more. We should be demanding that our politicians deliver universal housing, universal healthcare, universal education. Like, these are things that should be within reach. And I think as individuals, it's just so easy as individuals to disengage and go, well, there's nothing I can do about it. But so I think it's kind of a concerning trend, but I guess also a call to, you know, if there's enough of us that care and ask for better and demand more, and work in this space, whether it's your career, whether it's volunteering, whether it's just being more vocal in your advocacy and your discussions with your friends and family, I think we should be asking for better in terms of social justice, equality, and how our politicians are delivering that for us.
Very true. Sophie?
Love that. Agree with everything that everyone said. I don't know what the greatest challenge is that we face, but I think the thing that underpins it all for me, certainly climate change, housing, what we can expect from politicians, is a need to work out ways of collectively imagining how our society can look different. And I think about that a lot in terms of our over-reliance on prisons and this real default culturally, sort of as in white person, culturally ingrained acceptance of prisons as the only way we can deal with harm. But I think it also applies to how we can imagine a society that, you know, treats the environment with respect and where everyone has somewhere safe and decent to live. So I think there's work for all of us in whatever profession, but particularly the legal profession, where so much is assumed to be true and unmovable. It's important for us to be thinking that, you know, we created these systems, they can be dismantled and we can build new ones. We just need to work out what it is in terms of how we want to imagine the type of community that we want to live in.
Very true. I think there are so many pressing issues that young law students can be thinking about and thinking and things that like young people will be soon getting into professionally. I'm very sorry that we've run out of time if we didn't get to your question in the Q&A, but I would like to invite all attendees to visit the ANU Law Reform and Social Justice website. It's sort of a link on the ANU College of Law website. There's also a number of Facebook groups to join all of the different portfolios. Yeah, thank you so much to all of our panelists for making the time this evening. It was really such a stimulating and eye-opening discussion to hear about the diverse work that you really can do in the social justice space. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your knowledge. And thank you to the ANU Law Reform and Social Justice coordinator for organising this panel as well. Have a good rest of your evening.